Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us live today. I might just wait another minute to see if we might have a few more people join us. So today I'm going to try and keep it to the hour, but we'll see how we go with that. Might be a little longer, might be a little shorter. Hey, Faith. Yeah, also just a bit of housekeeping. If you guys have any questions or comments throughout the session, please just pop them in the chat, and I'll make sure that I check in there throughout the course of the session. So, hey Sharon, thanks for joining, and thanks Rosemary. It's nice to see you too. So we'll get started. Just welcome. I've already said thank you so much for taking the time to join today. And I'm really excited to be sharing this because in my experience, I've found that emotion can actually be quite a tricky element to fully process and release. And the more deeply and authentically that we can experience our emotions, the more deeply we can heal from past pain and trauma that might be still keeping us in suffering or limiting our sense of joy and ease. So if you're here, I'm guessing that something in the title spoke to you. I'm also guessing that you feel there's some level of disconnect in how you manage your emotions. And I think that for all of us, everyone, there's some level of disconnect. It's just a question of whether or not we're aware of it and whether we're ready to have a look at that. So with emotions, we normally go one of two ways. We can be quite external with our more extreme feelings, and we might become reactive, projecting our expectations and disappointment or our pain onto others. And often this is also when we feel we have to fight for our right to feel or defend that we're not too much in who we are. So just a quick check-in. Does anyone relate to that? Who here has done, just pop a yes in the chat box if you can relate to feeling that sense of overwhelm and having your emotions get a little bit too much for you. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's something that we all do at some point. And now the other extreme or polarity is that, we'll then find that we'll tend to outthink our emotions. So what I mean here, and this is something I used to do really, really well, it was that I would rationalize, I would excuse the personal situation that might have potentially upset or disappointed me or us. And we might tell ourselves that it's okay, it doesn't really matter. And this kind of approach then suppresses what we're feeling, or that suppresses our ability to kind of listen to what's going on underneath the surface. So can everyone relate to that one as well? So we've got the extreme extroversion, and then we've got this introversion. Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Thanks. And, it is all of us. So we are each going to use these approaches differently depending on the situation. So depending on how safe we feel to express ourselves. And sometimes if we hold back in one relationship, we'll explode into another. It's kind of finds balance, but it's really actually distorted. So in my personal experience, I ended up feeling really unfulfilled. I felt unheard, like perhaps I'd betrayed myself by either behaving poorly to another person or by not honoring myself and speaking up and acknowledging how I felt. So the path that I want to share with you today it's really simple, 3 simple steps, but it's about healing from the ego side of emotions. And this then allows us to be more in touch with the underlying emotion. So our authenticity, it puts us more in touch with, our vulnerability, but in a really empowered way. So before I get started or go into it, just a bit about me. I know some of you know me more than others, but I'm a spiritual mentor and healer and an ascension guide. So as well as studying various healing modalities, everything I teach or share comes as a result of my own direct experience. And so while I do love my life and this work, it's not actually been all that easy at times, and it's certainly not always been fun. So what it has always been is purposeful. It's been fulfilling, and for the most part, pretty amazing. Because in my own facing of what we might call the shadow aspects, the more difficult or uncomfortable emotions, that is, I'm able to share the light with others and to help ease and accelerate their own journey of healing. So when we think about emotions, I'm one of the first people to admit that I've had a very distorted and misinformed perspective of how our emotions work. So, this includes how they contribute to our overall experience of our humanness. And in fact, for most of my life, I was totally dissociated from my true emotional nature. So I thought I had emotions and feelings, but honestly, since a really young age and a few quite hurtful experiences, I learned that my emotions simply made me weak, or they made me open to criticism or mockery. And so in writing this kind of pattern or story for myself, I found that if me expressing my emotions made me feel weak or vulnerable, then I wasn't going to keep tuning into them. I wasn't going to keep connecting with them and sharing with them. So I became really rational. Like, I became really good at outthinking my emotions, and I thought I felt, but what I really, I just thought about feeling. So I'll go into that dynamic a bit later, but, my ego was able to project emotion if necessary as a means of protecting me. So I would get angry or jealous or excited or happy. But these were feelings that were actually protecting my vulnerability or aligning with the subconscious patterns and rational thought. So, it may sound a bit clinical, but I wasn't analytical about it at the time. I was just dissociated from anything that made me feel vulnerable or hurt to being judged. And thank you so much for sharing in the chat there. Yeah, I know it's such a common theme for all of us, I think. So the funny thing about this work, so I dissociated from my vulnerability and the ego had kicked in. So I experienced emotions that were created from the ego level of consciousness and from the subconscious patterns that had shaped my personality. And I know some of you, we've touched on the false beliefs in other sessions. So to remedy that, I made myself invulnerable. So unfortunately, that meant that I was also never able to connect with anyone, and not at the level of that my soul kind of craved, that I knew was there, but I didn't know was there. And I wasn't able to connect with myself. So the cost was that instead of feeling, I would spiritually bypass this outthinking my emotions, because I was so good at being reasonable and seeing other people's perspectives, and especially putting other people's needs before my own. And the bigger cost was perhaps that if I had too much bottled up, I might potentially explode. Some of us, and I know I would drink a lot in my past incarnation of this life. That would help me with anxiety. It'd help me to feel okay to say what I was feeling, but I wouldn't acknowledge I was feeling. And so whether you're a drinker or not, this explosive nature of the dynamic, where we can project onto others, or the expectation that someone else is responsible for my anger or my emotions, is a pretty toxic scenario, both for me and my loved ones. So I did get into quite a dark place. And as that kind of dynamic wound tighter and tighter, I didn't know what was happening. And I was either outthinking and rationalizing or distorting and projecting it all, to those around me. So I knew I wasn't happy, but I couldn't control what was happening outside of me. And I didn't know what was missing. So, I invite you to just consider, how you relate to that story so far. And thanks, Faith. Yeah, vulnerability means unsafe to some. And, I know the work of Brene Brown. If you've heard of her, she's done a lot of stuff around vulnerability and courage, and how they're two sides of the same coin. And, a lot of people, you suggest that to them and they're like, no, being courageous means you're not vulnerable. But it really is. It's about allowing yourself the potential. Like, we draw strength when we allow ourselves the potential to be seen, and to be truly seen can be quite a risky proposition when we first start contemplating it. So, so, it was less than easy at first. And, I'd start to focus on something like the felt sense, which, as I'll be teaching through this process, it can sometimes be quite hard to find. So when we start doing the work, we discover that emotion is not actually a thought, it's something that we feel. And to fully allow ourselves to process and digest that emotional energy and release it, it's about the balance between recognition and feeling. And so I mentioned courage, and it is a different kind of courage that we require when we go deep into this kind of work. But it's also, it's also really joyful, because we're finding our light and we're finding our way home to ourselves. So in my experience, I had stuff bubbling up from years back, but I also felt my heart opening in a new way. And I started being able to honor my own needs. For the first time, I was listening to that innermost subtle wisdom of my own being, rather than the rational, logical needs that I'd used to survive. So gradually, I found a lot more peace in myself and a lot more ability to let others be who they are without it meaning anything to me. So, relationships that had previously been perhaps not always easy started filling with so much more love, because I wasn't expecting them to feel, what I wasn't giving to myself. And I mentioned drinking. I don't drink anymore, not because there's anything wrong with it, but just because I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. I don't have anything that turns me towards it. And even when I tried to drink, it doesn't cohere with my energy field anymore. But that's just a bit about my own experience. And the tools that we're working with today are going to work, whether you feel everything and it gets overwhelming, or whether you tend to minimize and find it really hard to tune into your emotions. So everything here is going to be a practice. It may, like I said, it may or may not come quite easily, but it's curiosity and kindness to yourself that's going to help to open it up. So I'll just have a quick look at the chat here. Yeah. It's funny how a lot of us will drink less and less as we progress along that journey of becoming, and that's the thing. And it's not about going cold turkey. It's just about doing what feels right for us in the moment. And so thank you for sharing that, Sharon. So my challenge is when feelings come up and I have to figure out how to calm the feelings. And that's sort of that's definitely what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to see if I can share the screen. And it's quite funny, because as I was going through putting this together this week, and I was like, one of the first points that I make, hang on, let me just go back. It's quite basic. And I thought to myself, it's probably a bit too basic. And then I had an example come up for me where I was actually quite emotionally triggered. And I went through exactly these 3 steps, and it was exactly what I needed to transform from being really upset, really disempowered, to creating a great situation from it. So, our emotions are key to our personal journey. And we're unable to move beyond the mindset of suffering and victimhood if we're unable to observe and process our emotions in a way that empowers us rather than controls us. So as with anything that I share, receive what resonates. You can take on what feels right and maybe leave the rest of it for later, or you can take it on and have the curiosity to maybe play with it and practice and see if it fits in a deeper way down the track. But there's no attachment. So first of all, why do we get lost with emotion? So it's not about the blame game. It's not about looking at, oh, my parents did this, or this person did that to me. Not at all. That sort of scenario, we can have that awareness as an insight on how emotion was modeled for you. So maybe that will help you to understand the patterns that have been formed. But it's never about pointing a finger, because that in itself is disempowering. That takes us into victim mentality, which means the power is out of our control. So, a lot of our patterns were learned based on how we felt when we were a child and we showed emotion. Maybe our parents listened, maybe they didn't listen, maybe they, it's like boys don't cry, girls are allowed to feel. I personally developed the sense that I needed to be like a boy, like strong, so that was my thing. The other reason we're so lost with emotion as a whole, as a society, is to do with the thought epidemic. We're taught, and it seems to be a common idea, that every problem can be solved if we can just think of the right solution. Every relationship issue can be solved if I can just think of the way around it, and it's so often not the case, when it comes to our humanness, because thoughts are important, but balance is what we're about. We have a left and a right brain, we have an aware mind and a thinking mind. And whilst an emotion has a thought element, if we don't feel it, then we're missing half the puzzle. And the other thing is the isolation. Like, where a lot of the time we're taught to be ashamed of showing who we are. There's the fear of judgment if we're not like the crowd, or if I do show that perceived weakness or vulnerability, how am I going to be treated? How are people going to see me? And that can be really scary too. So I mentioned spiritual bypassing in the introduction, and I think that's a really good, just cautionary note, because spiritual bypassing, it's where we have the cognitive ability to transcend the situation, like I referred to outthinking the situation, and it's where we can rationalize using spiritual reasoning. We can say, oh, that person, they're just reacting out of a wound. They're just, the saying, hurt people. And on one level, that's absolutely right. There's no need for us to get all aggressive or vengeful or I can't remember the word, but reactionary over somebody else's problems, essentially issues that they're projecting onto us. But that doesn't mean that we don't feel it on some level as a multidimensional being. So just because I can see why a person might have acted out or hurt me, it doesn't negate our personal experience, but it might mean that we perhaps don't need to react in the same, we don't need to meet them in the aggression. We can take our emotion and we can honor that, and we can nurture ourselves without needing to either ignore it by spiritual bypassing and excusing it, or going into the fight. That's what we so often do. We fight back. We meet yang energy with yang energy. So curiosity is an amazing tool. So and I'll get into this again further in, but if you notice yourself in the thought pattern of excusing something or rationalizing something, doesn't mean you don't do it, because that's perfect. You're able to recognize a situation may not need to impact you as much as it does, but also be curious to see, what does another layer of me feel about this? Or just ask, am I avoiding feeling something about this, or am I really okay with it? So the curiosity, especially when we're in that habit of thinking, can just help break us out where we might have become so used to the habit of not reacting or not feeling in response to something. It helps to bring this up. So in our multidimensionality, we have the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical components. And each of these needs to be honored in the process of emotion, really. We tend to think emotion is just the anger, the hurt, the reaction. But emotion is an energy which moves through our entire multidimensional light body in different ways. So in doing this work, we've got costs and benefits. Like, what's the cost of not doing the work and the benefits? So I think a lot of us here recognize that unprocessed emotion and unprocessed thought, or unbalanced thought, it's going to store in the body. And our body is basically a 3D printout of our unprocessed or undigested thoughts, emotions, feelings. And, that can reflect in our posture. If we're feeling the weight of the world, we're going to, punch forward. Our shoulders, where we carry our responsibilities, are going to fall out of line, out of whack. But it can also go into the organs. Things like anger reflects in the liver, so perhaps liver dysfunction. There's a whole body map we can go into about that. In relationships, this is probably one of the most dominant spaces that emotional energy is shared. And so we'll have, you can either improve your relationships by being able to know the boundaries and your own energy in terms of what you're feeling, own your reactions and your responses. Or, as I've mentioned that I've done before, we can damage our relationships by not being authentic with ourselves, and then finding ways that our ego will protect us and react within relationships. And I think I gave an example of that before. So our emotional patterns, usually the surface ones that we start looking at, are generated from the sense of self, the patterns, the subconscious patterns, the beliefs, false beliefs that are formed within us of lack and limitation. Maybe our ego is protecting us from feeling like we're unlovable. So, we will act out if somebody triggers that within us. And so in doing this work, this process of emotional awareness, we find that we can start to rewrite, we can loosen the grip of these subconscious patterns, start to create a little bit more empowering ways of going about things. And our emotions are the flashlight on the path of life. So when we start using this process and tuning into our emotional awareness, it shows us where we are maybe feeling lack and limitation. Whereas previously, that old saying, it's like, oh, it's just how it is. But when we start to take curiosity to how we feel, we can perhaps start to release the energy that's held around those and create new approaches and new outlooks. And yes, some of us, we will have really rigid patterns, really rigid belief systems about certain things, and they'll make us feel a certain way. It's like we're the whole thing of everybody gets offended so easily these days. And that's because, we might have this belief system which we're so rigidly holding on to. But if we can perhaps look at the emotions that arise, what the story is beneath that, then we can start to rewrite that and find, more inner peace, more freedom, more joy. So it's really all about freedom and not having our outside world dictate to us whether we feel good or whether we feel bad, basically. So the first step, and this is the one I was saying, is just, it seems really, really simple. But this week, I received a text message, and my initial response was to, and this doesn't happen very often to me, but was to just explode. And I retyped my response a couple of times. And, in the end, I completely dispersed the energy. And whereas if I hadn't, I know that I would have damaged the relationship with this person. I would have ruined the day. We were supposed to be catching up that day. I would have ruined, our lunch. And it would have created a tension and an unresolved tension instead of empowering me. And I'll share more about the experience later. But, I was able to pause, to breathe, I did rationalize a little bit. We don't completely avoid the thought process, but it enabled me not to act in heat and not to act in anger. So the pause is the space between our stimulus and reaction. So we naturally grasp at something which is familiar and protective. And so we will reflexively go into an emotional response or a reaction which has been pre-programmed into our subconscious. That's natural, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the pause allows us to examine that. And, where I've said sometimes the pause does actually come after the reaction, especially when we just start to practice this work. We might not notice until, 10, 15 minutes later, maybe even at the end of the day, that we become a little bit reflective and a little bit introspective about the trigger and what occurred for us in that space. And as we practice and we become more reflective, we can become more adept at that as well. So the ability to reflect, we need to catch ourselves suppressing. And this is, I think, even harder than the explosive side of things, because if we're not making waves, there's not really anything to look at. And this is why I mentioned the importance of curiosity. And often when we have a habit of suppressing ourselves or not tuning into perhaps deeper emotions that may be there, we might walk away from a scenario and we'll feel a little bit diminished or depleted, like unfulfilled. Or there might just be a little bit of an icky feeling in our body because we haven't listened to ourselves, or we've let somebody else get the better of us, so to speak. And so when you feel those feelings, that's the opportunity to look within and to go further. So when we pause, we also want to breathe deep. So a few deep breaths is spaciousness itself. It's where we allow the space of stillness, to step back from the initial pain or hurt that's going on. Breathing and pausing allows us to shift our level of thinking from the victim, like reactionary, what's this person done to me, to sovereign, to going like, how do I want to feel? Looking at how am I going to feel if I actually react this way? How was I going to feel if I sent that text message? Those words wanted to come out of me, but I know that as soon as I sent it, I would have felt really mean and really horrible. I wasn't attacking the person, but I did curse. How will I feel if I react this way? And will it actually contribute to the outcome I want? Is it going to support me, be self-supportive? Will I feel better or will I feel worse? And so in the pause, we might not actually resolve the emotion or the feeling that's coming up for us, but we're at least stopping ourselves from exacerbating or consolidating, creating a bigger pain story. So with the pause, I've already mentioned we want to breathe deep. And at the bottom here, I've mentioned emotional stress release. Now, this is actually a tool I learned in kinesiology, and we're not going to go into the full practice of it, but emotional stress release is based on the fact that we have certain acupressure release points, which will help us to soothe our energy. And the emotional stress release points, they're your frontal eminences. So these 2 points, and when we're stressed out, we quite naturally pop our hand just across the top of our head. So I invite you just to take this awareness on, that if you do catch yourself perhaps going into a reaction or going into an explosion of I find indignation often is a good descriptor for the variety of emotions that can happen when we react. And if we just breathe, and you can close your eyes, and we won't go into necessarily the practice now, but you can place your fingers or your whole palm across the frontal eminences. So just those 2 points on your forehead. And just take a few deep breaths. And this will help to disperse the energy and the intensity of that. So I also work with tapping with clients, but we won't go into that in this webinar. So yeah, so that's the power of the pause. So I invite everybody to just take a deep breath with me now. Partly because I'm not used to talking this much either. So as Viktor Frankl said, between the stimulus and response, there is space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And that's the key word there, that freedom. We're no longer owned by our emotions, and we're no longer owned by our reaction to the outside world, but rather we're creating, and we're deepening our inner empowerment. So just another point, someone else's behavior is a reflection of them, but your response and perception is a reflection of your own inner harmony. So how are we all traveling with that? Just pop a yes in the chat if that's resonated with you. Yeah, thanks, Tricia. Yeah, so we're going to pop the next one. We'll pop that into a bit of practice. So thanks for sharing, ladies. So the second point is the point that we've basically forgotten in our society today. We've forgotten that we need to feel it in the body. And unless we actually feel an emotion, that energy is not going to be properly processed or digested by us, digested by our system. So emotion is energy in motion. And the way I see it is that there are aspects of thought and feeling in emotion, feeling being the sensation and thought being the story. So you might think to yourself, this is making me really angry. And you might react from that space. But how does the anger make you feel? Is it something that makes your guts churn, perhaps? We feel our feelings in our center line, in the torso, our soft underbelly, so from the throat to the lower belly. And this ability to feel is key in processing our emotions, and it can actually alleviate a lot of the intensity of what we think is going on. So when we pause to feel, it will often dissipate. And in this situation that I had this week, I received the text message, and I eventually sent back something which was much more productive and much more able to contribute to a good outcome. But I didn't resolve the emotion. I was still feeling quite tense. And then I sat and I just allowed myself to tune into my center line. And I sat with the sensation, and I felt it. It was like a tension all across my shoulders, all through my chest, this anger. And we'll get into the story of that in a minute, but I was just feeling it. And I was feeling, the tension, and just letting it be, embracing that feeling without needing to explain it. We outthink it. That's what we do. So this is how we let the emotional energy move through our body. As I said, it's in the center line, and it's the storage of this emotional energy will form patterns both mentally and physically, which I alluded to before. Our body consciousness, if we don't release our anger, we might have liver problems. Or if we're particularly fearful, maybe there's a kidney element. Kidneys are related to fear, amongst other things. So, it's not just mentally that then we learn to react. Maybe I allow a particular experience to shape my entire opinion of somebody. And so every time their name is mentioned, I get this horrible feeling in myself because I've judged them. So the other thing with emotion is that it often arises as a result of unresolved past experiences. So these false beliefs, these patterns of personality and identity that we develop in our first, say, 7 years and up to the age of 21, particularly. So when we consider resetting our system and actually tuning into the felt sense, as we start to peel back the layers, it can give us access. It's a really simple practice, but it can give us access to starting to resolve and ease some of the pain that's stored in our body from experiences when we were much younger. Because what happened when we're younger, we continue to relive that pattern and recreate our experiences based on our expectations, based on this subconscious story that was created from an experience. So dropping out of the head and into the body, it gets us from our head into our feelings and the actual sensation, which is part of our multidimensional experience. And I just wanted to add as a note here at the bottom that what we're talking, it can feel pretty heavy, what we're talking about, all this, this anger, hurt, shame, whatever. And it can feel heavy if that's all we focus on. But the process that we're going to do, you can, and I teach on this in another process, is we can also bank the positive. So often we'll find that, our experience or our consciousness, it's Teflon for blessings and Velcro for pain. So we focus so much on our pain, but we forget to focus on our gratitude, or the taste of a delicious cupcake, or the smell of coffee in the morning. I don't drink coffee anymore, but I still love the smell of it. And to just the process we'll go through is it's about feeling anxiety so that we can have it dissipate, but we can also teach our body to become more familiar with the feeling of joy and pleasure. And the body goes to what's familiar. So if we start teaching it, we can rewrite those patterns in that way as well. So we may run a little over. No, we'll go perfect time. I'm predicting that. So we're just going to do a little exercise now, and it's only going to be a few minutes, like 5 or 10 minutes tops. So I invite you to just get comfortable where you're sitting. Let me just check in the chat. Yeah, Sharon, that's interesting. So your feelings are usually in your heart space, and that's often where we go for them, because we are, depending on the feeling, like our chest we can either expand or we will contract. But in terms of, and I'll just quickly share an example of this. So in terms of feeling the sensation of emotion, this is where, and I don't want to make it confusing, but in the experience of it all, the practice, like I've got a keenly curious mind. So the sensation can occur from our lower belly up to our throat. Emotional energy can be stored anywhere in the body. I might have emotional energy stored in my elbow because it relates to that particular body consciousness, or in my hips especially. And I had an experience last night in yin yoga, which is where we go into deep stretches. And so, this one was stretching out the hip. And yes, I felt it in the fascia and the muscle of the hip. It felt quite uncomfortable. And this is where we can get emotional during yoga as well, as because we're bringing out, emotional energy that's stored in the body. So I was deepening into the stretch, and then I started feeling the sensation of that emotion in my torso. I wasn't stretching my torso, but I started feeling, I think it wasn't pleasant, but I didn't have a thought to correspond with that. Sometimes I will, and sometimes I won't. Sometimes the thought will come to correspond with the felt sense in the torso, or it might take our mind to recall a particular situation. Sometimes it's just a sensation in the torso, and sometimes it's just clear being present to that emotional energy, which is really interesting. So for this practice, so find yourself in a comfortable seat, sitting relatively upright if you can, and closing your eyes, just gently closing your eyes. So taking a few deep breaths. With each exhale, just letting your body rest into the surface beneath you. And noticing the dark space in front of your closed eyes. Just allow yourself to bring to mind something, an emotion or a scenario, nothing too deeply effective, but maybe there's a source of stress, something stressful at work. Perhaps there's some anxiety about something, and just allow yourself to bring to mind the awareness of that experience. And now, as you're mentally aware of that experience, drop your awareness to notice the sensation of any feeling in your body. Now, this is from the throat. There may be a sense of contraction or tightness, perhaps in the chest, the center of your chest. There may be a sensation of temperature. It might feel warm or cool. Tension, openness. Including your awareness now down into the belly, into the solar plexus area. And the lower belly as well. So as you're noticing these sensations with a light and open awareness. So our mind is aware of a stressful experience, but in our body, we're aware only of the sensation. And as you feel that sensation, there's no need to explain it or to define it. Just noticing that sensation and holding space for it with acceptance and compassion. Now, as you sit with your awareness in the torso, this is enough. If we have pent-up feelings of anxiety, we can do this in a moment, or we can spend a little more time to really hold and nurture the sensations that may be going on for us. They may be uncomfortable, or they may barely be there. Just holding a light curiosity and a loving compassion for anything that you notice. Through the throat, the chest, the upper belly or the lower belly. And as you tune in, just ask how you can bring some love into that space. Maybe that sensation just needs to be felt. Maybe there's a message for you. And this is the difference between thinking and feeling. So I invite you to take a few deeper breaths now. Move your fingers and toes a little bit. And when you feel ready, just gently open your eyes. Yeah. Awesome. And I've just seen that note, Sharon. Yeah, it can be tingling. And energy or an emotional energy will often be reflected as tingling, temperature, tightness, or I find I get quite like I'll feel a bit nauseous sometimes. Like this is what happened at yoga yesterday, is this really strong release of emotional energy from my hips where we store a lot anyway. And I just got this wave of like, I call it metaphysical nausea because I'm not going to throw up or anything. I know that, but it just feels a little bit giddy and ick. So, how did everyone go with that? Was that, did you notice a feeling, or were you not able to notice anything? Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And as I said, when I started doing this, I felt nothing, this was a process that I learned, as part of a meditation journey. And, there's a lot of layers of other stuff that go to it, but, sometimes we do, we can use that process just to sit in meditation with an open curiosity to see what's felt. Or we can use it in a scenario like we've done today, where I guided you to look at something that might have been a bit of anxiety, and I've actually had this profoundly support me when I've had an onset of anxiety, a number of years ago. And just noticing the anxiety, noticing that there was nothing to be anxious about. So I did rationalize it, but thinking anxiety away doesn't get rid of it. Like you still feel crappy in your body, you still feel that horribleness. And this kind of experience, I sat with the feeling of the anxiety in my belly, and eventually it didn't take long. It released, and I was able to continue the drive. Thanks, Tricia. Yeah. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. And the throat might have a lot of tension. We often hold ourselves in our throat, in our chest, as I said, in our belly, in our guts. And when you think about grief, we might feel it in the heart. But I remember when the most intense grief I've ever felt, I literally felt like I'd been gutted. Like I felt, and I didn't have all of this awareness to help me deal with it, but I felt like my guts had been ripped out. Shoulders and neck. Yeah, okay, a lot of headaches. Yeah, interesting. Headaches are such an interesting phenomenon because they also relate to our cranials, which is, to do with the breath and with limitation as well, but also our limitlessness. Well, that's not good, Sharon. Have you been and checked that out? Because I will advocate for the felt sense, but we also need to know whether we have physical. Yeah, awesome, amazing. I feel things. We do need to respect the physical process as well. Yeah, but often, we know our bodies so well that we know when to listen to them. So I'll get on with this, otherwise I will talk forever. Bear with me. How do I do this? Okay. So the third point, and this is the part which I've been kind of, we get really stuck in trying to solve the cognitive problem. And I've been really focused on having the pause, the breath, and the felt sense, and allowing ourselves the spaciousness to get out of our heads. But to have full balance, often there is a story or a wound. And by going into the reflection of what that might be, it just pops the shackles off that little bit more, and as I always say, healing is a multidimensional practice. And, I was great with my spiritual awareness and my mental awareness. And, I thought my emotional body was great. But then when I started digging around in it, I had decades worth of stuff, which I hadn't fully, I'd mentally resolved, but not emotionally resolved. And so I've learned to love a good cry. I'm not afraid of crying. But I don't seek it out either. You don't need to, we're not about wallowing in the punishment of things. So when it comes to the story or the wound, this is the part. So in the situation, my example this week, so I managed to edit my text message sufficiently so that I didn't destroy a relationship, which I wouldn't have done anyway. So we paused. Then I sat and I felt in my body, and then which really cleared the felt sense of it. It dissipated discharged the intensity of it. But then I was really curious, because I'm like, I don't want this to happen every time this person says that to me. I can maybe resolve this situation, but I want to know that I'm empowered so that next time this person or this story comes up, I am sovereign. I don't react. I can respond in a way that is reflective of my nature, in a way that I'm loving myself. So what's the story I'm telling myself about the experience, or what was the story? And so I sat and I reflected on that. And it was on the drive actually out to the lunch that I did that. And if I share quite honestly, it went quite back to childhood. And it came down to the fact that I had taken this message to mean that I'm not important, that I was not a priority, and that everybody else is more important than me. Now, that's not at all what the message said. But it was really, really empowering, actually, and really interesting for me to recognize where that pain was coming from, or where that trigger had, what button that trigger had pushed. So, what's the story that we tell ourselves about the experience? And that's, to be able to reflect on that, because there will be a story. And sometimes the story will be childhood things. Sometimes the story is simply like, oh, that dude's a jerk, they cut me off in traffic. Whereas we could write any story. We could say, oh, the guy's wife's just gone to hospital, so he's in a hurry. Or, anything like that. We can write positive stories, or we can write negative stories. But until we start digging into it and doing this work, we will write the story that corresponds to our deepest hurt. So the false beliefs, the limiting beliefs that we formed as children, or, through our developmental years, are going to be what we base our story on. The other point I make here is we get caught in the reaction, and the story can actually be a bit hard to locate, and that's fine. We give ourselves love and patience in the practice of this. We don't expect ourselves to master it, and if we flare up, we allow ourselves, we forgive ourselves, we acknowledge the part of ourselves that was hurt in that moment, and perhaps we look at the story or wound that caused us to react that way. So the other question we can ask is, what are we making it mean about us? If somebody cuts in front of you in traffic, what does it mean? Why does that, bug us so much? Or if somebody walks past us in the lunchroom without acknowledging us, why would I be upset about that? What does it mean about me that hurts if this person ignored me? Another question, and these are really good journal prompts. What's the vulnerability that this emotion is protecting? And this is the long-term pattern. And that's where I said, with my scenario, it was something about not being a priority when I was young. That's the way I felt. And, so we look at what might lie beneath our original reaction. And we also might like to look, so how would I prefer to respond? You know, if this story is about me feeling irrelevant or not good enough, how would I prefer to feel? Or, you know, if I get angry at somebody for ignoring me, how would I prefer to experience that? No, I can write a different story. And this is the cognitive part. I can say, oh, Jeanette's just having a really bad day. That's not my problem. That's not my thing to carry. I don't need to think, oh, it means I must have done something to upset her, which I know as, you know, as a people pleaser, that's probably my go-to, is like, oh, what have I done wrong? So we look at how would I prefer to respond, and, you know, how can I feel more empowered in this situation? You know, what perspective or what experience can I create that would be more empowering? And so going back to this text message example, you know, I was able to respond in a way which, instead of reacting from the wounded self where I wasn't a priority, I looked at, what do I want to happen? And I offered that as an option, instead of assuming that my story was true, instead of assuming that, yeah, I really wasn't a priority. And as it turns out, this other person changed their arrangements and we were able to sort everything out, and it all worked out for me perfectly because I didn't lose my head. And so, yeah, so look at what's going to make you feel like you're worthy, sovereign, you know, you're looking at an outcome which will please you. And all of these questions, they can be really helpful to journal, because a lot of the time, most of the time, I don't normally do this. I don't often do this in the moment, because, you know, sometimes, you know, it's quite superficial. It's just like, you know, why did Bob ignore me? And sometimes it's like, why did I feel so distraught at the fact that I got a text message changing plans or something like that, you know? So to journal, especially when we're looking for the deeper stuff, can be a really productive and nourishing practice. So, yeah, so non-judgmental curiosity and practice are the keys to any form of self-mastery. And self-mastery is a path to freedom. So we've got and honestly, like these three tools are both super, super simple, but you can take them as deeply as you would like to go. And, you know, they're super simple, but they're access points to do the real healing work, you know, for yourself, and to really explode into so much more empowerment. You know, it's like, instead of being reactive and relying on the world doing what you expected or doing what you want, you're taking control of your story. You're taking control of your feelings, like what's felt in the body. And it's a healing thing. You know, when we release this energy, we release the tendency towards illness, you know, and with meditation as well, we further enhance our ability to be well, like really well. So that concludes, I think, all the content. I'm only a little bit over time. Thank you for staying, everybody. Now, if you're interested in exploring this further, I have opened up a few complimentary sessions, 30-minute sessions, where we can just have a bit of a chat, take a look at, you know, your biggest struggle, maybe look at ways to move forward. And I was going to pop that into the chat. Let me just see, how do I stop share? Yeah, so oh goodness, I love technology. Okay, so what I'm going to do is catch up on the chat. Yeah, it is. It's really empowering. Like that's the thing with this process, like taking ownership of our, it's not about the blame game, as I mentioned, but taking ownership is just, it's where we become sovereign, because we are choosing, our our experience and our reality, and it is how we paint our reality. Now, what I'm going to do, because the link is not coming through, but I'm going to send an email with the replay later today. So if you do feel drawn to working in a little more depth, there'll be a booking link if you'd like to connect. And yeah, Faith, it's about self-mastery. Yeah. And it's an ongoing process, like I said, when I started doing this, like I would think of quite extreme things and I would barely feel the sensation in my body, Oh, thank you, Sharon. If I understand if anyone has to hop off, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to hop off mute or pop it in the chat if you like. Yep, that's cool. Thanks for that, Sharon. But all right. Cool. Well, if there's no questions, if anything does come up, feel free to reach out. Yeah, Faith, it's so true. But that's the thing. So hard work. I love that you've said that. Thank you so much. So it's so logical and it is such hard work but the more we do it. Oh, thanks, Rosemary. It's been so lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a beautiful afternoon. So hard work. It's really, because we get this kind of tendency to slog away at it. It's like it's such a drain. And I'm really finding that the more deeply we can go into it, the more the more we're able to have this perspective of the process, and we have a practice through which we can free ourselves, we can start to dance with it a little bit more. And I love I use the term non-judgmental curiosity a lot, because curiosity to me there's that element of wonder, an element of fun. And if we look at it, the human experience, like I always say, being a human, an incarnation is like an extreme sport for the soul, and so many of us are just strapped into this skin suit going, what the actual F? But, I think the more we can deepen into ourselves and deepen into the practice. Yeah, exactly. Well, like, and that's, it's me some days too, but I also go into, that what the heck, with a knowing that it is part of the ride, and with a knowing that I'm resourceful, I am supported, in the universe and with those around me, and everything will eventually work out. It may not work out how I want it to, but it will work out. And I think by the time that when we get to when we get to doing this work, I tend to find that this is where shit starts to get good, pardon my language. Because it's where I didn't swear the whole time. I did really well. But by the time we're doing this work, it's like when we're ready, it's when we're ready to really know ourselves. It's when we're ready to really embrace the journey and, rise as women, as light workers, as beings who are here to expand as ourselves and into ourselves. So that was my response. Yes. So it can be hard, but it can also be less hard. I don't know if that was what a tangent I just went on. Anyway. Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you, ladies. Yeah, amazing. Everything is always working out for me. Yeah, it is. It is. That's right. We are amazing. We are effing awesome. And And it's the discovery of that, you know, the more you can do this stuff, the more you recognize when you're not being awesome, and you're like, why am I not being awesome now? And that's when we go through this work and we're like, where does that feel in my body? What's the story I've created that's not awesome about this? So thank you so much. I do feel like I could talk to you ladies forever. And I thank you so much for listening and for sharing today. And actually, I just want to talk. So building my armor, Sharon, that's a really good point, because I've spent so long dismantling the armor that I became so strong in this world and so untouchable. So it's as though we dismantle the shell, but our armor becomes our strength in our heart. You know, our armor is our sense of self and resilience. And, you know, I still catch myself armoring sometimes, but it's just so much easier to be that vulnerable, authentic self, and know that I got me, the universe got me, and it doesn't matter if Bob doesn't want to talk to me in the kitchen. I'm fine with that. So so anyway, lovely ladies, I will wind up. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here and allowing me to share this with you, and thank you so much for for receiving. I love it. And like I said, I'll send that replay shortly. So have a beautiful afternoon, and I will see you again soon. Bye.